doing tonight? Good. Thank you. Awesome. We are continuing our series on how to simplify your faith, because the reality is sometimes we make the mistake of trying to complicate. And when I say we, I mean like people like me who are in charge of teaching Scripture, teaching the Bible, teaching how we should live. Sometimes that lends itself to going deep into philosophy or theology or something, and we tend to get into all the nuances of something that it makes it sound more complicated than it is. But the reality, the Christian faith at its core is simplistic. God sent his son Jesus to die for us because we have fallen into sin. We have made our own decisions, gone our own way, and we needed redemption because of that. And so Jesus came and took our place, took the punishment of sin upon himself to pay for our freedom and to pay for our salvation, pay for our hope, to pay the way to have a right relationship with God once again. And then our job is to follow in his footsteps. So at the end of the day, it's a simplistic faith, but is it easy to live out? Absolutely not. You know, when you're trying to connect with somebody, it is natural to get familiar with the things that interest them, right? So like growing up and even today, if I had a friend that was really getting into something, I would get into it as well, probably, because then it would be another thing for us to connect on. And so one of those things was Call of Duty growing up. How many of you are like Halo people? I know Halo is another one. Yeah, we did Call of Duty because we weren't Xbox people where I was from. But I'm just kidding. We played some Halo. But I like Call of Duty, so got real into it. Guitar Hero was another one. We all played Guitar Hero together. And let's see, what was another one? We went to, I discovered my love for All American Rejects and Relient K and all kinds of pop punk because of my friends. And so that was fun. But not only when you're trying to connect with somebody or you're trying to learn their interests, but also when you're like crushing on somebody, you want to know what interests them as well. So like when I was in 8th grade, a girl moved from California, cute blonde, right? And I was crushing on her pretty hard. I spent the whole week with her at church camp going into my 8th grade year, and I was like, she's cute, you know? But the problem was I wasn't very subtle. And you know, like when somebody's like trying to be cool around people and you can totally read it because it's not how they're supposed to be acting. That was me, like to a T. So everybody knew that I kind of like had a thing for her. She probably knew it. I could kind of sense the feeling was kind of mutual. So I was hanging out with some friends one night, and they're like, dude, you should just ask her out, right? Just call her up right now and ask her out. Because back then we called each other. We didn't text because texts were like, I don't know, like 30 cents a text or something like that. And you only had 200 of them for a month. Otherwise, your parents would like ground you and take your phone away for texting too much. But so we called people, and all my friends were like, dude, you should call her. I remember it was like 9:12 on like a Thursday night, or maybe it was a Friday night. It was a Friday night. We were all hanging out at my buddy's house, at Caleb's house, and we were sitting there, and like, you just need to do it. I was like, I've never asked a girl out before. You know, like when you're in 8th grade, what does asking a girl out mean? Like, you can't take her anywhere. You can't drive. So it means nothing other than labels. And so, but I was like, I've never had a girlfriend before. And they're like, you just need to call her. And I was like, I would have done it eventually. But then Caleb's like, I'll give you $10 if you call her right now and ask her out. So I did. So I called her. And I was like, hey, how's it going? I had to call her home phone. Her mom answered. I was like, hi, this is Zach from church. Is Beth there? And she goes, yeah, just a second. Beth, phone's for you. Some guy named Zach. Oh, okay. Hey, how's it going? This is Zach, by the way. Yeah, I know, my mom told, oh, okay. And I was like super nervous. And meanwhile, I had like 5 guys around me like, you know, telling me to do it. I was like, hey, so I was wondering, you know, I'm trying to block them out. You know, how's your day going? You know, super awkward. Just imagine awkward 8th grade me. I looked like I was 5. And so then, hey, I was wondering, would you want to be my girlfriend? And they're all like, he's doing it. And I was like, just wait. There's that silence. She's like, yeah. I was like, really? She's like, yeah. I was like, sweet. Okay. Awesome. We'll talk later. She's like, yeah. I was like, okay. I hung up. And we all went berserk. We're like, oh, she said yes. And he like took out $10 and threw it at me and was like I was like, yeah. So I got $10, which in 8th grade was a big deal. And I got a girlfriend. And sad to say, it did not last, but that's okay. You know, I mean, sadly at the time, obviously I'm happy with how things worked out. Goodness. Hey, when you ask your first girl out, you remember details, okay? It's nerve-wracking, right? I'm happy with the way things ended out. Chelsea's better than this California person that came to Joplin, Missouri. Whatever her name is. Didn't remember that? No, I'm just kidding. You get my point, right? And so at the time, I was bummed because about halfway through my 8th grade year, we broke up. It was really sad. Actually, it was really sad how we broke up. My dad was the youth pastor, and so we had Sunday school back then, and my dad asked her parents to come and give a talk on dating in middle school. And then the next day I broke up with her because literally I was sitting right here, and they're like, yeah, 99.9% of relationships in middle school don't last. And I was like beat red. My buddies were like elbowing me right in front of it. I was sweating bullets. Like, thanks, Dad, for doing that. Yeah, we broke up the next day because I felt so guilty. Okay. It's all right. I'm over it now. We eventually became friends, and it was fine. It all worked itself out. In fact, like my whole sophomore, junior, senior year of high school, I had a lunch. You guys have a lunch table you sit with the same people every day? No matter who any of us were going out with or anything like that, we all just sat together at lunch. And she was at my table. We were friends. It's fine. It's not a big deal. But, little 8th grade me, first time, what makes it better is her parents they weren't aware of our arrangement that we were boyfriend, girlfriend now. My mom dropped me off at the movies with her and another friend and talked to her mom at the, your moms do that. They talk to each other and it makes you nervous. Well, I leave and my mom's like, So I talked to her mom and she says she's not allowed to have a boyfriend. You're only special friends. I was like, what's that mean? But anyway, this is way too much detail that you guys don't need to know. But all that to say, when you really want to connect with somebody, you get to know the things about them to try to connect with them. In other words, when you care about somebody, you take an interest in what they're interested in, right? Fair? Everybody on the same page with me, right? When you want to get to know somebody and get connected with them better, you take interest in the things that they're interested in. This is the part of life, it's part of relationships. You learn that, you grow in that, you get better at that. You stop making relationships about yourself, you start making it about the people you're with. And it's part of maturity, it's all about growing up, and it's a good thing. And so in this series, we're trying to simplify our faith. And how does that look like if we're to take kind of these concepts in mind? If with any other relationship you have to take into consideration the interests of the other person, then how does that look in our relationship with God? The verse kind of this series comes from Matthew 22, verse 37 through 40. And it says this: Jesus replied, he was talking to the religious leaders of the law. He said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these two commands." So, how do we actually love God? Love the Lord your God. That's the first and greatest commandment. How do we do that? How do we actually love God? There's a lot of challenges and potential obstacles to being able to do this well. One being we can't see God the way we see everyone else or the way we see everything else. And so a lot of our God talk and thoughts seem very abstract and unpractical. Anybody else relate with that? Like your relationship with God feels abstract and not really day-to-day, not practical. It's hard to imagine what that looks like in an everyday life. It's always been a struggle for me, especially at your age. And so that's a potential struggle there. Another one is maybe like other people haven't exactly simplified things for us, right? Sometimes people talk over your head when it comes to faith-like things. I've probably been guilty of that because I'm a nerd, and when I get honed in on something, I drive the point to the ground, and it's probably unnecessary 90% of the time. But for the sake of those conversations, sometimes we go in a little bit deeper and a little bit, make things more complicated than they should be. So other people haven't exactly made it easier for you, and that might be a difficult point in your faith. But let me ask you this. What if loving God was about taking an interest in what God's interests are? If we're going to have a right relationship with God, or a good relationship with God, one that is thriving, one that actually impacts our everyday life, then what if that was more about taking interest in the things that God takes interest in? Now, I get that that's a simple concept, hence the series, But what does that actually look like in practical terms? What does God care about? What's a big deal to God? If we're going to love God, that means we love the things that he loves. And so it's only natural to then look to see what God says we should care about, what we should love. Now, in the Old Testament, this was before Jesus arrived on the scene, so before the Gospels, before the New Testament, before our faith as we know it became what it is, there were different ways that God communicated with his people. So in the Old Testament, he would speak to people called prophets, right? And there's a whole genre of the Old Testament called major prophets, minor prophets. And so that's like the tail end of the Old Testament, second half of the Old Testament. And it's God would use these people to communicate his message to them. So you had people like Moses, or you had people like Jonah. God said, hey, go tell the Ninevites my message so that they stop. You know, if you saw the VeggieTale impersonation, the VeggieTale version, stop slapping each other with fishes, right? Did anybody see that? Yeah, if you didn't, you're missing out on a key part of my childhood, but it's all good. Like, the Ninevites were terrible people who slapped people with fishes. And so, Jonah, go tell the Ninevites to stop fish slapping. Anyway. God uses prophets to speak his truth. And so that was one way God communicated with the people. The second way was through his priests in the temple, and they would communicate what God cared about when it came to worship and commandments and all that kind of stuff. And then the third people that God would talk to would be his kings. So in the book of 1 Samuel, you start to see the nation of Israel start to rebel because they used to be ruled by judges, and they wanted a king like all the other nations. So God appoints his prophet Samuel to anoint a king, and that started with Saul. He did bad. Then David, then his son Solomon, and then there's a whole line of kings under a divided kingdom after that. But God would communicate through them what he wanted when it came to ruling his people and making them different than the nations around them, which if you read your Old Testament at all, you'll recognize that was a consistent struggle for them. Kind of like us today. God calls us to be different than everybody else, but oftentimes you look at other Christians and it seems like, well, how are you different than all my non-Christian friends? Because you talk the same way, act the same way, tell the same jokes, and watch all the same stuff. So what really makes you different? And this is a struggle that's been like humanity long. And in the Old Testament was evidence of that time and time again of God's people just not living out the way that God desired for them to. And so God's character could be seen through all these different people, but all of them fell short. Maybe some of you've been turned away from faith because you know somebody who said that they were Christian, or you looked up to them and they just totally did not exemplify what being a Christ follower was supposed to look like. They did things that, like with their mouth, that they would say one thing and live another way. They would speak in a way that was like, hey, I'm all about God and Jesus, and I love his commands, and I only want to do right by him. It's almost like they speak Christianese, where there's all these church words, and then they go home, and then they're around their friends, and they start living a different way. In other words, they don't practice what they preach. And for many of us, we've seen Christians who live that way, and we're like, no, I don't want anything to do with that. It makes our faith feel more complicated than it really is. And so we see time and time and again that people failed when it came to living out what God called for us to do, what life should be like. And so then came along Jesus, right? A lot of people kind of have a misconception that Jesus just ripped down everything that was taught in the Old Testament and started over and is like, nope, this is how you're supposed to live. In reality, he actually built onto it, and he raised the bar. He made the standards higher by making them less specific. Like think about this. If I tell you, you got to be home by 10:59, right? If you're here at 11 or later, you're in violation of the curfew and you will be punished, right? If that's the rule, when do you think you're going to be home? Probably like 10:59 and 58 seconds, right? You're going to push that boundary all the way up until you might not make it, and then oftentimes you won't. Whereas Jesus said a more broad rule that is actually tougher would be honor your parents. Because then it's not about the time, it's about they ask you to be respectful, to show up before everybody goes to bed, and if you don't, then you're dishonoring them. The standard's actually higher. Jesus put it this way in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, which was actually Old Testament law. Someone steals something from you, and they're punishments. There's eye for eye, tooth for tooth punishments. And he said, but I tell you, anyone, he goes, think about it with the murder one. He says, you've heard it said not to murder. And he says, I say if you are even angry with somebody in your heart, then you've already committed murder in your heart. Therefore, don't murder. When it comes to lust, you've heard not to commit adultery. Yeah, that's a hard and fast rule. Well, I say, don't even look at a woman lustfully, for you've already committed adultery in your heart. He made a more general statement, and he didn't give specifics. But you know what it is when you've done it. And he raises the standard even more. So he didn't come to abolish all the Old Testament. What Jesus came to do was to embody it perfectly. He came to fulfill it. Because all the other kings, the prophets, the priests, they failed. The whole nation of Israel in the Old Testament, fail after fail after fail. They would not exemplify the life that God had laid out for them. So Jesus came, said, tell you what, just love God and love others. That's less specific, but it's more difficult to do. Because under the law, under the rules, you can find loopholes. You can kind of, well, you're not technically breaking the rule, but you're not being kind. Well, Jesus says to love others and to love him. So does that make sense? He's fulfilling the old law. He's the perfect representation of the law and what it looks like when it's lived out in a healthy way. And so check this out. This was in John chapter 14. This is at the Last Supper. And so Jesus is about to be arrested this night. He's going to be crucified. And this is what happens, is they're all sitting around the table. And Philip asks something that he should know at this point, because they've been following Jesus for 3.5 years. And Philip asks him, he says, Lord, he says, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. In other words, he's going, just give, I want clarity. Give it to us straight, Jesus. Like, what is God actually like? Like, we've been around you. We've seen you go away to pray on the mountain. We've seen you, go to isolation in order to, spend time with God and pray and all that stuff. Then we've come and seen you perform miracles, and we've seen you do great things in the name of God. But shoot us straight. What's God actually like? And Jesus just gives it to him straight. He says, don't you know me, Philip? After all these years together, don't you know me? He says, even after I have been among you such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. In other words, if you want to know what God is like, look no further. Look at me. How would God love others? How would he treat others? How did Jesus treat others? What does God feel about the outcasts and the lepers and those who don't live up to the standard in society? How did Jesus show love to them? How did he treat them? What does he think of them? What about those caught in sin? Are they just, as the Pharisees would say, unclean? Or does Jesus show mercy and grace and forgiveness and then call us to radically change our lives in such a way that we also embody all of the law by loving God and loving others? See, Jesus raises the bar, but he does so in such a way that he gives us compassion. It gives us more freedom. So everything that Jesus' followers had seen him do over the past few years, that was all the Father at work in front of them. That was how God would treat those around him. They saw Jesus stand up to the power-abusing religious leaders. The arrogant, proud, and money-hungry who were keeping people from truly knowing God because of their standards, because of their religious devotion to the law and not to people. They were turning people away. How many of you know somebody who's so concerned about the rules that they've forgot the purpose of them? That's the Pharisees. The disciples had heard Jesus talk about a kingdom of God that was nothing like the Roman kingdom that they lived in, a kingdom that was governed with peace, service, and grace. They saw Jesus get close to the sick, bleeding, crippled, hungry, and outcasts, and they had seen him heal and feed these people, take care of them, and give them dignity. They saw Jesus treat women and children with respect, which in that time they didn't get. He raised the bar in society and elevated the value and worth of those that others deemed unworthy. They saw Jesus embrace the sinners. They saw him forgive his enemies. He didn't just talk about love, he modeled it. He modeled it with everything that he did by helping people who were close to him and people that were far away, people who believed like he did and people who didn't, people who looked like him and people who looked nothing like him, people who had a lot and people who had nothing, people who were labeled good and people who were labeled bad by society. Jesus showed and embodied all of the law by showing love to people in that way. If we want to know how God loves us, all we have to do is look at how Jesus loved. That's the Christian life. It does not get any more complicated than that. In other words, loving God equals living like Jesus. If we want to know, if we want to take interest in the things that God takes interest in, we have to love. We have to live like Jesus. We have to live our lives with the selfless abandonment that Jesus had. The disregard for our own well-being for the sake of others, which sounds extreme. But you read the pages of Scripture, you read the Gospels, you see how Jesus lived and how he cared for and how he loved those around him. The bar is so high. It's simple, but it's difficult. And we need each other to be able to fulfill this and do it well. Loving God equals living like Jesus. So the simple application is to look for one way to love somebody who's in a vulnerable time. I want you to think about how you can love somebody else who maybe is in a vulnerable state. They've been going through something difficult. Maybe they don't have any friends. Maybe they have nobody to talk to, nobody to process stuff. Maybe you're thinking of somebody at your school that you know has been going through a rough time, and you know they don't make friends easy, but they also don't make it easy for other people to get along with them. Look at it as a challenge. Here's some ideas. You can be a friend to someone who's not in a good place right now. You can be a mentor to somebody in elementary school. You can donate a small amount of money to help with some disaster relief. You can help out with the children's ministry or any other ministry here at church. You could visit a nursing home, hang out with people who are different than you, and you might learn a thing or two from their life experience. The list could go on for days. I told you earlier when I was asking Beth out, I was told I would get $5 or $10 if I did it, right? And I would like somebody to use this $10 to bless somebody else, okay? I want you to find that person that you've been thinking of as I've been talking, a way that you can show that love, you can show that grace, you can show that compassion to somebody that you know is in a vulnerable state and desperately needs it, okay? Well, when I pray and when I end the message, I'm literally just going to drop this and leave this right here on the front of the stage. And the first person to come grab it can have it. You can go spend it on yourself at Starbucks and I won't know. But I encourage you to use it specifically to do one small thing that will help somebody else and show them the love that Jesus would like to show them. You get the opportunity to be the hands and feet of somebody else. It's not a big thing, but it's a small practical step that you can take in your journey of faith in learning how to love those around you the way that Jesus did. It'll help you see people the way that Jesus sees people when you're looking for an opportunity to bless others the way that God has always called his people to do. Our salvation is not ours to hoard or to gloat over everybody else about, to go, oh, everybody, hell, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. Like it's your salvation is not for you to keep, it is for you to give away, to give the hope that you have found in Jesus to those around you. Living in such a way where you embody the love God and love others in a way that will radically change your community. That's my challenge for you guys this week.